Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd. Quick announcements. This is the next to last talk. Next week, we'll have Adrian Troy, or Truel, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, I'll find out next week, from Carnegie, who's talking about citizen science. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the point is, those of you who are taking the course for credit, after that talk, you will receive an email with the details of what you need to do to get credit. The basic parameters, which you knew at the beginning, are if you've attended all the courses in person, you're done because you've already and signed up on the sign-up list. If you've missed up to 2 of them and watched them online, you'll send an email to that effect. And if you're SCPD or other special cases, like people who had a conflicting course, then you'll send a verification that you've watched all of them online. No summaries or anything else like that, just honor code verification. Yes, I've watched it. Okay, what I was about to say about Adrian next week, and this is something that Scott was just commenting on, is we've had a series of talks at the end of this quarter, all of which in some way or another relate to the use of large numbers of people to produce interesting results in computer systems. So Dan Weld last week talked about applying AI techniques to crowdsourcing. Those of you who heard Michael Bernstein on Monday, he gave a talk on his systems for doing crowdsourced editing and other tasks that require more judgment than typical mechanical Turk class talks. And Adrian next week's going to be talking about, he calls it citizen science. Interesting question, what's the difference between citizen and crowdsourced? They have, in this question Judd's interested in. And then this week we have Judd Antin from Yahoo, who is looking at questions that go beyond sort of simple HCI, in particular thinking of motivation. If you look at the history of HCI, people have talked a lot about, let's assume you have a worker in a productivity situation, what makes them the most productive? And you don't typically ask what makes them want to work. But as soon as you start saying this isn't somebody who's hired by a boss and sitting in a chair and getting a job evaluation, it's somebody sitting at their terminal doing something which they could just as well do or not do, the motivation becomes a much deeper question, and it's not just a sort of subjective thing. There really are things that you can study and understand about it and manipulate in your design so that you can then come to it. And that's the kind of work that Judd's been doing at Yahoo, and he'll be talking about it.
Thank you very much. It's just so I'm clear, how long?
2 o'clock is the end of it.
2 o'clock is the end, so I will leave plenty of time for questions, I hope. So, hi, I'm Judd. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to tell you about my research in this area, which I'm glad sort of fits into a little bit of a trajectory over these last few weeks. I have a feeling that, or I hope that today will be a little bit different for some of you. I am a social psychologist, and so the things I tend to care about are at what I would think of as sort of at the human level underlying a lot of the stuff that really goes on today's social web. Self-efficacy, group identification, self-esteem, social approval, all those funny little biases and things that make us humans. And when we interact in social situations, we better understand them. So that's the genre of things I'm going to be telling you about today. But first I want to tell you a little bit about my group. So I am a member of the Internet Experiences Research Group at Yahoo Research Labs. And these are all the faces of people in my group. And we are a very diverse group of researchers who cover what I earlier described as the other category in social science and HCI for Yahoo. I'm a social psychologist. Elizabeth Churchill leads our group. She's a cognitive psychologist. That's her training anyway. Ayman Shamma is a media artist and CS type person. Bob does ethnomethodology. Marco is an interaction designer, especially with mobile. Vidya does cognitive neurosciences. She looks a lot at visual saliency and things like that. And then there's me. So we cover a lot of ground, and if you'd like to know more, I'd be happy to tell you. But first, a little outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to give you a brief and very, very self-serving history of motivation and incentives as they applied to online environments. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why motivation can be very hard to talk about, and I'm going to use the case example of gamification, which I've spent the last several years thinking about and writing about and researching critically. Then I'm going to present a little study to you that I did, which sort of illustrates the point that motivation is also really hard to measure, especially in online environments. And I'm going to use, coincidentally enough, a study I did on Mechanical Turk. And then I'm just going to finish by giving you some thoughts on the future. So let's begin with this self-serving adventure. A brief history of motivation, online participation, and social media. In the beginning, there was motivation version 1.0. A lot of the very early studies of, for example, open source software communities assumed the reason why coders did what they did, they worked on Apache or SendMail, was because they wanted to build skills, pad their resume so they could get a better, higher paying job. Okay. I don't know if that seems naive to any of you, but it does to me. And I think actually fairly quickly the research community moved beyond that and acknowledged it wasn't just that. But arguably, the social web has not moved beyond it. I don't know who remembers Google's Knoll project, K-N-O-L, okay? So the idea here was basically, there was a whole slew of projects that were like this, and they basically went like this. Look at how much people will do for free. If we pay them, they'll want to do it even more, okay? So Knoll is essentially, I'm simplifying, but it's like Wikipedia, except you would get cut in on the advertising revenue. Well, Knoll never really took off, and it's going to be shut down later this year. So even though researchers moved on, this is a common point of view, and but pretty quickly we moved on to being interested in other things. Okay, so this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, and this is great because we're bringing in other stuff that's important to people, like I don't know, food and water and sex, right? Those are important to people, but also things that have to do with esteem and belonging. The social and psychological side that I, for one, really care about, but it doesn't capture anything that's really unique about the internet. One thing that's unique about online participation is that the cost of contribution, the cost of participation, can often be very low. And that means that even very small rewards can be enough to tip the balance. And we don't really see that reflected here. And the fact that those rewards can be very small sort of led to this popular view, which I alluded to earlier, which is that people will work for free. And if I had to say there was one thing that got me so fired up that drove me in this research direction, it would be this article from 2007 in which George Johnson wrote, "No one but a utopian would have predicted how readily people will work for free. We're cheaper than hardware, a good thing considering how hard we are to duplicate." Okay, so this is like, what is this, 2007, but social media is exploding and we're having experiments with crowdsourcing and online collaboration. And this was a popular narrative. And the thing is, like I said, social and psychological rewards often are so small, they're hard to measure and they're hard to identify. And that led to the idea that people are working for free. But even though people are rarely paid for online participation, they never work for free. I'm going to, okay, that's a blanket statement. That's probably going to be hard. Nobody ever works for free. Okay, I'm going to say it though. I'll stand behind it. That's cool. Okay, so it makes it look like people work for free when the rewards are hard to identify. And so here's 2.0, what I'm calling 2.0, and this to me is mostly the world of today, and we see this everywhere. And this is actually from Yahoo's design pattern library, and we see these types of things across the web. But the problem here is that these are actually interaction patterns, right? But they became the motivation. Like the reason you would do something was because you were ranked, or because you got a badge or an achievement. Because you leveled up. And I'm going to, I think, go on my soapbox for that a little bit later. But, so this is largely the world of today. And then we have this very, very incremental step forward, which I would call gamification, which if you're not familiar with this is the application of game-like mechanics in non-game settings. But in practice, it means 4 things: points, levels, leaderboards, and badges. Let's just throw them on everything and see what works. Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But, just continuing the sort of trajectory of talking about how we've understood motivation and incentives, this I would say is indicative of something that's a little bit better, and we're skipping around in time a little bit, but incentives became more specific. Does anybody know about barn stars? No? Okay, this is something I hope you all will look up on Wikipedia. So barn stars are badges that Wikipedians give to each other for doing valued work. And they were debuted in 2003. This is not a new idea. Arguably, who made up this idea? It's probably like Caesar, who gave out medals to soldiers who've done a good job, right? Okay, but the good thing about Barn Stars is that they recognize valued work within a meaningful social context. They signal something about the work we care about. So in that respect, I would say Barn Stars are a good model of something that's meaningful in terms of the badging space. And we all are probably familiar with Foursquare, which in many ways was the poster child for gamification. And I would say that actually Foursquare is a fairly good example because a lot of the badges had some personality. They recognized something that was tied to your geolocation and your habits. And even now, actually, this screenshot is pretty old. So if any of you use their mobile app, I would say about 9 months ago, they really made an upgrade, which sort of made it even a little more specific and added more of that social context. So people have really been trying to get a grip on this, and it matters for design. It matters for engagement. It matters if we want to promote serious online collaboration and participation. And of course, it's certainly about making money for people like Yahoo and Foursquare and Google and Facebook and et cetera. Keeping users coming back and clicking is where it's at, right? Okay, so with that as a backdrop, I just want to say a few words about actually even talking about motivation, especially in an online context, can be pretty hard to do. One reason is because we mix up the notion of an incentive and the notion of motivation. Okay? Now these are fuzzy concepts, and I'm going to, as soon as I sort of tell you my definition, somebody can probably go, but hey, it's, and feel free. But in my definition, these are too often conflated, but really what happens is an incentive is the reward, and an incentive triggers motivation. So if the carrot is the incentive, the motivation is hunger, or like vitamin A deficiency, I don't know. But it's a fuzzy distinction, okay? So it's hard to talk about this. And yet there have been a lot of efforts in social psychology and sociology to try to understand how to classify incentives. And here are just a few of them. So pecuniary and non-pecuniary. If you're not familiar with this terminology, pecuniary is something that is monetary or convertible to monetary. So a gift is a pecuniary reward. This is a pretty classic distinction, right? There are lots of ways that we can think about an incentive that has nothing to do with a tangible or monetary or pecuniary gain. Here's another way, which any of you have done any reading about incentives, you may have come upon the notion of crowding out, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But here's another distinction which gets kind of mixed up, intrinsic and extrinsic. An intrinsic motivation comes from the task itself. It's the love of the game or the love of learning. Whereas extrinsic comes from outside the task. The thing about this is we often confuse intrinsic with internal and extrinsic with external. And this, I don't even really have a good handle on this yet because, this is confusing because internal rewards have a lot of restrictions, right? They have to be social and psychological because they come from within. But they can be extrinsic, right? Because I can study hard either because I love to study or because I don't want to disappoint my parents or because my parents will dock my salary or not my salary. That's not how I grew up. Yeah, right. Where's my salary, Mom? No, allowance. That's the word I'm trying to think of, right? So this is again a fuzzy distinction. But here's another one which has appeared less in the literature, but I actually think is really important. And this is another way of looking at it that I find useful, which is basically, where does the trigger come from? Is it a social trigger or not a social trigger? And in a lot of ways, this maps to a distinction in social psychology. There's really two flavors. There's the psychological flavor and the sociological flavor. The psychologists, as a generalization, care about processes that happen in the mind. They care about affect and emotion and things like that happen inside your mind. Whereas sociologists, unsurprisingly, care about interpersonal interactions. So non-social rewards sort of would be the love of learning or a year-end bonus, and a social reward would be like competition, social status, social pressure, those things. Okay, so we've been trying to understand how to even talk about this, how to classify this, and just to talk a little bit about why this is hard, I'm going to bring the example of gamification. Okay, I already sort of described earlier why gamification, what gamification is, and I have spent a lot of this year, in particular at Yahoo, I've done a lot of consulting with the various Yahoo properties to talk about, how should we do this and how should we do this well? And often I encounter a sort of initial view, which is like, this is a good idea. Why, there's really no reason not to do it. It's low-hanging fruit, right? And so I had to come up with a lot of different reasons, essentially, why not gamify. So let's just come up with a few of them. Number one, it doesn't work. It does work in some situations, but arguably often it's very perfunctory. Why did anybody do something more when you gave them a badge that said, yeah, you commented 10 times? Like who's going to participate more in that situation? But there's lots of other reasons. It's a distraction, right? It's something else to worry about. Maybe if you have an instrumental goal, you don't want to be encouraging people to pay attention to rankings. Another really good reason, it's, we have only so many developmental resources. And we have not only that, but online systems are increasingly bombarded with sort of sensory overload, and so it can be a matter of attention deficit. They don't appear on my screen until like after the animation is done, so I can't be all slick about it. Cluttered interfaces, another good reason. No long-term transition. I would argue that most of these gamification strategies are sort of flash in the pan. Very little attention is paid to how you engage over time. So actually, you may be doing yourself a disservice by focusing on sort of one-shot rewards like badges. Unknown differential effects. We assume that everyone is motivated by this stuff the same, but that's false. There's no reason to think that would be true. In fact, there's decades of research in sociology and psychology which shows people respond differently to different types of rewards. Some people are more actively seeking social status. Other people are actually adverse to social status and adverse to advertising it, to signaling it to others. Why would you want to give those people a badge, right? So differential effects that we don't understand.
So just a point to this motivation and kind of like why not to gamify and why to gamify. So in my research, I did a case study about co-creation online and specifically why do people participate. It was co-creating magazine content. Mm-hmm. And it looks like the motivation factors changed in the course of the process. So first, the people came on the online platform because they wanted to get awards. But when they became part of the community, like the social factor, became more important.
Yes. Great. I wish that you'd made that comment in about 30 minutes because it would fit really in with my narrative. But I completely agree with you. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about is this idea of adaptive incentive systems. Well, adaptive to what? Three things. Individual characteristics, contextual characteristics, and what I call paths of participation, which is the idea that people have trajectories, not just one, but many. And we don't have to sort of blindly throw it all at them and assume that some new user or a user who does a certain type of thing is going to be the same as a more experienced core user who has many diverse activities, et cetera.
Do you distinguish between good games and crummy games? Because it seems like a badge for 10 comments isn't a very good game.
Well, so there's been a lot of debate amongst the game studies community about, actually a lot of people get very upset about the fact that the word game is used in this situation. Because arguably there's nothing game-like at all in these types of interactions, and they sort of misunderstand fundamentally why games can be motivating, which has, levels, or I think people thought, levels, right? And you get shiny things that you put on your avatar, and let's do that, and that's why games are fun. Any scholar of games will tell you that's actually not the case, that, games are motivating for other reasons that include, sort of improving your self-efficacy and exploring your identity and mastering skills, and that's what fun is, a lot of people will argue. So, you could just think like a bad badge is a bad game, or you could think every badge is a bad game.
So, and I'm curious, I have a ton of friends who participate in World of Warcraft and games like this, and in those games, the badges are very motivating to them, like how high can you fall before you die kind of badges, which are maybe equivalently lame as 10 comments, but for some reason for that small community of my personal friends, which is very not scientific, that is very motivating for them.
Yeah. I would argue that what a badge needs to be truly motivating is a meaningful social context, which is why I was using the example of barn stars, but World of Warcraft is another great example. When you put people in an environment where they share values and have a set of shared activities that are seen as important, not only for themselves, but for establishing their identity and coalescing as a group, when you reward those things and you advertise them through things like badges and leaderboards, that can really be effective. The 10 comments example is a bad example because it's there's no social context there. And not only that, why would I care about doing 10 comments? And not only that, why would I care if anybody knew that? Why would I expect to receive some kind of status or reputational reward on the basis of that? And one of the things I talk about a lot is that it's you can get a badge for, let's say, eating 10 burritos. I don't want that badge, except if Terry dared me to eat 10 burritos. Then I really want that badge, and I'm going to put it on every profile I've ever done. So it has a social context.
So is that why Foursquare kind of does the whole mayor? Is that like how it relates to mayor? Like, I don't really care if I'm a mayor and nobody else knows about it, but if I'm the mayor and everybody in this room knows about it, then that's great for me. Is that the...
Yeah. And so I think the mayorship thing is most effective when you become mayor of. So I think. Okay, let me just explain this by example. I think being the mayor of your neighborhood coffee shop is probably much more meaningful than like being the mayor of SFO, right? Because in different ways. Let's just say for different reasons. Because being the mayor of SFO, I expect that a lot of people check in at SFO, and so my name is going to be there, or my handle, or whatever. And so that's motivating for a certain type of reason. On the other hand, the local coffee shop, this is a group of people who I know and see every day, and probably like battle out with the other regulars, to be the mayor, and that's motivating for a totally different set of people for a different set of reasons. So that's the nuance I think is really missing in gamification. That's sort of the message of all of this, is like, where does the real reward come from? It's not the badge. It's the reason why you give a crap about the badge.
So when you say it doesn't work, do you mean it doesn't work for the person or it doesn't work for the system? Because, I'm okay, if I'm a designer of a system, I'll be completely okay with putting a badge for 10 comments if it makes people comment more, regardless of how well, they feel about it.
Right, but actually I usually go from the other perspective, which is to say that, at least at Yahoo, we're interested in driving stickier engagement, and I understand that, and that's important, but maybe what a badge does is it actually doesn't promote more participation, it promotes higher quality participation, or it makes me happier doing the participation I'm already doing. I would actually prefer the latter two, because I'm a social psychologist, not an MBA. But I work for a large internet company, so I think it's a matter of balancing. And what you're pointing out is that what is essentially the dependent variable we're going to optimize on is a huge and complicated question. And often it's time on site or clicks or something. And I would argue those aren't always maybe they're good metrics, but they shouldn't be the only metrics.
And badges don't optimize any of those metrics.
If you talk to the big three players in the gamification space, which are the three Bs, Bunchball, Big Door, and Badgeville, they'll all of their metrics are about, we increased time on site by 300%, and the click-through rate was blah 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 blah, and session length and all those things. So I think that there are ways to do that, but again, for all the wrong reasons potentially. Like what if your gamification system is encouraging more low quality participation, and now what we're doing is essentially flooding your system with bad comments because you're getting ranked up the leaderboard for doing that. There's a balance. There's a balancing out there, a very complicated balancing act.
Effect of motivation, the effect of gamifying on motivation. Is it universal or is it cultural?
I wish that you could have submitted your questions in advance so that I could call on you at the appropriate moment. So I would say it's differential for the reason we talked about earlier. People have different dispositional characteristics which make them more or less interested in a social status reward or more or less interested in social approval. But also there's a huge cultural component, and I'm going to get to that. Hold the horses. Okay, so maybe I'll go on just for the sake of time. So here's the end of my list. Crowding out, which has to do with intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. If you haven't heard of crowding out, the basic idea is if you love to do something and then I pay you to do it, it can become about the money and not about the love. So the money, the extrinsic reward crowds out the intrinsic reward, and ultimately your motivation can be lower. So when we have in an example of education, there have been some examples where they will give you pizzas for reading. Pizza Hut did this in New York. It was like pizzas for books or books for pizza, reading for pizza or something like that. And in there have been some very famous economists who have argued that you should pay for better grades, pay kids for better grades. And I would argue, okay, we can argue that on the merits, but I would argue in addition, the question is not so much what happens when you pay for grades, it's what happens when you stop. And what is the message that paying for grades communicates about the importance of education, for example. So, very sticky issues. Wrong tone. You're at the top of the leaderboard in the cancer support forum. Okay, so there's another thing. That's the contextual factor. And then, exploitation-aware, like I said, there's this game scholar, Ian Bogost, whose academic shtick is primarily to be a sort of loudmouth, but he's very smart. He's just, that's what he does, and he calls gamification exploitation-aware because he thinks we're just coercing people into doing things they don't want to be doing using badges. But most of all, gamification fatigue. How many systems can have badge systems, and can it remain effective? Okay, so we spent too long on that. But so here are a bunch of reasons not to gamify. And, but there's another one. There's sort of a fundamental problem with the theory of gamification. The underlying theory is based on behaviorist psychology, right? Behaviorist psychology is the domain of Pavlov and Skinner, rats sort of pressing levers in exchange for cheese, okay? So that's the idea here, right? Schedules of reinforcement. This is very simple. If there's a behavior and I reward you for that behavior, you're going to do that behavior more. If I keep it up at the appropriate intervals, I'm going to sustain your participation over time. It's that simple, right? Here's the problem. No one ever argued with Skinner about whether the cheese counted as a reward for the rat. That was self-evident to people. I am going to call BS on the idea that there is something intrinsically motivating about points, levels, leaderboards, and badges. We've been talking about this for the last 10 minutes, really. And just to sort of hone this example, I think that these things are at least 2 levels too high in terms of our focus. These are user interaction elements. They're at the top of the stack, okay? Underneath that is what I would call incentives. And this is, again, sort of my way of thinking about it. Like, you can pull up any number of books that would disagree with it. But so the leaderboard is the UI technique that invokes a competitive incentive. But underneath incentives is the motivation. The social psychological processes that make competition motivating are not intrinsic to competition. They're about things like mastery seeking and reputational benefits. And that's where we ought to live. Down here is where we ought to live, okay? And, so we just talked about that. So competition, there's nothing inherently motivating about competition unless you care about mastering skill, reputation, social status. One of the ways that a lot of my economist colleagues sort of are starting to recognize the importance of these non-pecuniary rewards is to talk about attention, right? Why do people blog? Why do they write nasty comments? It's because they want attention. But why do they want attention? Attention is not a motivator. Attention is, page views is maybe the way we most often, or the example where it's like you're mayor of SFO. You want attention. Everybody's going to see your handle. But attention is about self-efficacy. It's about social status. And it's about those things for different people for different reasons. With Elizabeth Churchill last year at CHI, we did a little paper that was sort of trying to identify the social psychological underpinnings of badges in general. And we identified what we think are 5. The first being goal seeking, right? And there's a lot of great research here about how the best goals are those that are just out of reach. Dan Ariely is a behavioral economist who has a really great paper which he calls Conceptual Consumption. I really recommend it to everybody. And in it, he sort of reviews some research, and he argues that we actually consume goals the way we consume goods. And we'll trade off other types of rewards in exchange for consuming goals. So I recommend that paper to you. A second reason, right? Instruction. Right? Badges are really good for this because if you can see the list of badges, like the list of Barn stars on Wikipedia, is a list of the things this community values. So it communicates something about how to be a participant, right? And then there's reputation. And so Peter Kollich said reputation is a substitute for direct experience. If you knew everything about a person's past, you wouldn't need reputational information. You were there. And this could be at the very general level when you see this about a person, like in a badge, right? This is a level of interest or engagement. This is a power user, a core community member, or a newbie. But it's also specific skills. On Stack Overflow, Perl, C#, whatever. You're awesome at karaoke. You can have a reputation for being a jerk. I hope not. Okay, so status and affirmation, right, is sort of linked to the idea of reputation, but social status is a status hierarchy. It's a hierarchy of power. It's a mark of distinction, and the important thing here is that it would be motivating because of the expectation that you would receive some reward from others who will look favorably on your higher status. So when you put it that way, you can see that won't always be true, right, and it will depend on the environment. There's a lot of talk about the transition on Facebook. I was just talking to Pat about this in the car. Like, when you're in college, the status comes from posting the best night out drinking picture. to Facebook. And then you graduate, and all of a sudden, the incentive structure flips almost immediately. You enter the working world, and all of a sudden, that kind of status is actively devalued, right? So status is contextual. And affirmation is the flip side of that, right? Because often what a badge is a reminder of what you've done and what you've accomplished. That's why Boy Scouts and Eagle Scouts wear sashes, right? And then related to all of this is what I would call group identification, right? Which is the shared set of activities and values that bind a group together. These are the types of things that people do here. These are the types of things what we'd like you to do. And there are a couple others, which I won't go into too much detail. So pride is a really good example. Why do you do this? Because you want to be proud of the things you do. I've done a lot of work on Wikipedia and motivations for participating in Wikipedia. A lot of people say that. The idea of contributing knowledge for the world is really important to people and prideful. The idea that Wikipedia is a repository of information and my otherwise esoteric knowledge about this lake in Iowa that was near my house matters. I am proud of contributing that to the world. Catharsis is a great one, right? That's a lot, when you talk about flaming and trolling behavior, this is a lot of what we talk about. And then self-efficacy is something that I care a lot about. I would argue that this is one of the worst problems we have in contribution communities, is what I call the black hole problem. I've just arrived, you're telling me I should contribute. So okay, I wrote a comment, I uploaded a photo, then what? I'm not getting any feedback. I don't know how the system works. I don't know what happened. It feels like dropping my contribution into the black hole. I have very low self-efficacy. It feels like my content didn't matter.
Wait, that's not self-efficacy.
How do you mean?
Usually when we talk about self-efficacy, it's what I believe about what I can accomplish.
Right.
Not will anybody notice or care.
No, fair enough. And I guess I should reframe it and say, so I meant it in the first way, which is to say, if I feel that my content, that I can't make a difference through my content by contributing it, because it has no effect on anybody. Why would I feel competent? Maybe I feel competent to make a comment, but the fact that it doesn't matter, the fact that I'm not making an impact on the product or on anybody else's experience gives me a sense of low self-efficacy. Like I can't make a difference here. I can't contribute to this group pool of information.
Yeah, I think that's overgrowing what self-efficacy means beyond its original construction.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And if Albert Bandura were here, he'd probably punch me in the face. But I would welcome that conversation. I'd like to talk about that some more. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you about this little study. Okay. Where are we here? Did I lose a slide? Oh, I so lost a slide. Did I? Let's see what happens. Oh, I totally lost a slide. This is disappointing. Sorry for this interruption. All right, well, it's gone. Goodbye. Okay, so the best laid plans. Okay, so what the slide was supposed to be was a nice little infographic, which is about the work that some people like Nicole Ellison and Jeff Hancock have done on online dating. And they've done these really clever studies, okay, where they will do things like they'll recruit a bunch of people who have profiles on online dating sites, and they'll look at what they said about how much they weigh and how tall they are and how much money they make. And then they'll recruit them into the study, and they'll ask them to come to the lab with their W-2, and they weigh them and measure them and look at their W-2. And what they find is that online dating is full of little lies. Little lies, okay? So, and what the graphic would have shown you is that on average, in this particular study, women will say they're slightly lighter than they really are, and men will say they're slightly taller than they really are, and make a little bit more money than they really do, okay? Those are not lies, okay? Those are what I would call social desirability effects, okay? And social desirability refers to our tendency to respond in a manner that we think others would find favorable, right? And this is not lying, okay? This is about implicit attitudes, right? We are not always willing or able to report accurately on our attitudes, right? And there are all sorts of these sort of stable biases, right? And this is important to me because lying conveys something intentional and potentially malicious, right? It's just that people don't always, you can't expect to ask a straight question and get a straight answer. That's just not how people work, okay? So social desirability is real, and it occurs in many domains. And there's been a lot of interesting social psych to try to uncover why social desirability occurs. And in general, there are two ways that we think about social desirability. The first is what I would call self-presentation or impression management. I don't know how many of you read Irving Goffman's, dramaturgical metaphor, all that stuff. But essentially, Goffman would say that our whole life is an exercise in self-presentation, right? Is molding our public image, presenting a stylized and contextually appropriate version of ourselves, and conforming to expectations that we don't always know. But there tend to be these social norms which tell us, I probably shouldn't come out and tell you if I'm really horribly racist, because there's this social norm against being racist, which I would argue is really justified, but so maybe there's a bad example. So that's half of it. The other half is relevant to the racism example, which is self-deception, right? It's sort of an attempt to deny the true underlying attitudes by expressing a different one, okay? And it's not that it's not that a lie. This is a genuine belief, but it masks the underlying one. So these are sort of two cooperative theories of social desirability. And so the question that I wanted to ask in this study is, oh yeah, go ahead.
But it is a lie, right? If I know my height and I say I'm actually 6 and I say I'm 6'1", that is a lie.
That is a lie.
It's dishonest.
That is a lie.
So why are you suggesting that it's not?
I would argue that the question of height is a little bit different than the question of, for example, racial attitudes. So in the sense of height, yes, that's a flat out lie. Or maybe actually, let's not even go there, because I tell the world that I'm 6'6", which I am on a good day, and was I'm really probably 6'5" and a half or 6'5" and a quarter, right? But not only, when I tell people I'm 6'6", it's not a lie. It just reflects the way I want to be perceived. I've conceived of my identity as a really tall person, right? So, and with the attitudes, it gets even more squidgy, right? Because I don't necessarily have to, I don't think the calculus is my true attitude is that I'm horribly racist. However, the world wants me not to be horribly racist, therefore I will express a not racist opinion. It's more like I have this underlying implicit model of an attitude I have as being socially undesirable, and it causes me to express something different than I would express in the absence of that underlying bias.
Those things seem to be different at a qualitative level, right? So you have the tools to measure your height, you have the tools to measure your weight, and you could be honest about that. But the question of whether you're racist is something, that could change depending on the context you're in. So I asked you, are you racist against this group? And if I was part of that group, you might say no to me, right?
Right.
But if I ask you what your height is, you know that we have the instruments in the world to measure your height and we can verify your height.
Okay.
So
Fair enough.
I'm wondering whether there's a...
If you want to call it lying, I'm cool with that. I think I'm just being more generous to the human spirit or whatever, to think just because there's an idea in which a lie is potentially malicious, and I don't think there's anything malicious. I mean, there's something malicious about racism, but I think in general social desirability is not malicious, and it doesn't represent a deliberate step-by-step process of deception. It's more like I don't know if you've read any of the behavioral economics like Konovan and Tversky and prospect theory, which is about how we perceive gains and losses differently. It's not those are implicit attitudes. Those are underlying aspects of our cognition which influence the way we see the world and express ourselves. But if you want to call it lying, I'm cool with that. Do you have a question?
So it's social desirability which would make me say I'm 5 feet, not 4'12".
Right. Yes. Or it's the social desirability which, for me, turns 6'5" and a quarter into 6'6", because I have the model that, right or wrong, being taller is better. And anyway, my identity is wrapped up in it. So for me, the socially desirable thing is to express that I'm slightly taller than I actually am. But let's stop talking about height, because height has an absolute answer and weight has an absolute answer. Maybe I shouldn't have used that example. I'm really interested in social desirable expression of attitudes, in particular motivation, which is something there is no correct answer. There's no objective way to measure your motivation. We can't put you on the scale. So all of a sudden it becomes much more difficult to understand what's the true attitude and what's the attitude you express because you think it's the right answer or the answer that you would want to hear. Do you have a question over here?
I was just going to comment, even with things like weight and with GPA, when people misreport themselves in the desirable action, it also predicts their changing themselves in that desirable way. So that if I overreport my grades are more likely to go up because I'm thinking of myself as I'm a 3.8 sort of a person when maybe actually I was only a 3.7 or whatever, right?
So it can be aspirational. And it can actually...
And correlated with actual change.
Yes, it can be, and the other way as well. Right? There's another domain of research which is called stereotype threat. And if you want to look it up, I'm going to vastly oversimplify a very nuanced area of research right now. But it's basically like if you prime somebody to think, so if I tell you that people with a certain haircut, with your haircut, perform worse on average on an arbitrary perceptual test. I made all of that up. You will tend to conform to, on average, people will conform to that expectation, even when you make it really arbitrary. And the reason why, you can think of it as sort of, people live down to stereotype expectations and they live up to them too. And there's a lot of research in this which is about the reasons why, for example, people of color and certain types of minorities perform more poorly on standardized tests than other types of people, for example. I encourage you to look into it so that we don't digress too much. But great point. Yes, it can be aspirational. Okay, so I'm interested in whether there are expressions of socially desirable motivation, right? Now, the problem is that studies of motivation, which have been done in many different online contexts, tend to use surveys. And there are lots of studies that there's a problem with surveys, which is that they're self-reported, okay? And when you have self-reporting, you have this potential problem of social desirability. And there have been lots of studies which have shown these social desirable effects on surveys that have to do with really divisive and hot-button issues like ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation, et cetera. There's also been some interesting research in organizational behavior and marketing research. Recently I was looking at a study which showed that due to social desirability, people will over-report their level of physical activity. They'll tell you they run more and walk more or whatever than they actually do because of the perception that being an active person is socially desirable. There's this idea of vocational stereotypes, okay? So what a vocational stereotype is essentially like a stable preconception about the type of person who does a certain type of job. Think about your mental model of a fireman or a school teacher or somebody who runs a knitting shop, and then think about what your preconceptions are about who that person is, what are their characteristics, everything from like age and gender, but also why they do what they do, what type of person they are. Is this a person you would trust? Is this a pro-social person or a self-interested person? So we have all these sort of underlying preconceptions about the reasons why people do what they do. And if that's the case, there might be connections between that and the ways that we talk about our motivation. Why should I be doing this? What I would say about why I do something might conform to my expectation of the right reason, based on my vocational stereotype, my image of the type of person who does crowd work or opens a knitting store, okay? And the way this is usually handled, the fact that we have this bias, the way this is usually handled in surveys is through indirect questioning. And these get really hokey, okay? It's like, imagine an other who you don't know and who doesn't know you and what they would think about this type of question. Something a little bit less hokey is like if I ask you about an attitude, instead of asking you about an attitude, I might ask you to estimate the distribution of that attitude in the population. And then I would combine all of the distributions that I get from people. And that is supposed to give me a response which is relatively more free of the social desirability bias. I don't know if you agree with me that all of those things get a little bit hokey. And actually what I'm about to show you is like a little bit hokey too. But here is the basic experiment that I did on Mechanical Turk. Okay, so this is the participation part of the talk. Okay, so this is the standard way in which we ask people about why they're motivated to do something. It's sort of like the check all that apply model. Or maybe we're asking on with Likert scales, like 1 to 5, agree, disagree, whatever. Okay, so raise your hand if the following are motivations for you. You want to learn about research at Yahoo? Yeah. You people. Okay. You want to support HCI at Stanford? Okay, very good. Arguably that was subject to social desirability. You're interested in motivations for online participation. Oh, okay. You guys who haven't raised your hands yet so far, you're suspect. Okay. That's right. What about this one? I'm looking at you people. Okay? Okay. Okay, so in this example, this last one is supposed to be the socially desirable one. So, okay, this is the standard way of asking this question. And if you cared whether I knew that you were really here to heckle me, you might not answer honestly to that last question. Okay? So in this experiment, I used a technique which is called the list experiment. And this is a pseudo-experimental technique, and it works like this. I'm going to show you by example. I'm not asking you to tell me which ones are motivating for you. I'm asking you to tell me how many. So if you say 0 or if you say 4, then I know your true attitude. But if you say 1, 2, or 3, I don't know whether the one that you could say 1, and I don't know whether it's this one or this one. Okay? So you have plausible deniability, right? You have a certain kind of cover, which might encourage you to answer let's not say honestly, because we get into trouble with the semantics, but let's just say honestly. To answer in a way which reflects your true underlying attitude. So in this experiment, we have two conditions. The treatment, which has all 4 of the possible motivations. And I ask you to tell me how many between 0 and 4. And then we have a control condition, in which is the same, except I leave out the one I think is subject to social desirability and ask you for a number between 0 and 3. So this is the same list. The only difference is that one item is missing. This is a group level method. Okay? We can't get individual data. This is a group level technique. So what we get is the difference in average number between the two conditions reflects the proportion of the population that would agree with that missing statement. Okay? So if the average here was 2.8 out of 4, and the average here is 2.4 out of 4, right? 2.8 minus 2.4 tells me that 40% of you are here to heckle me. Awesome. Okay? Now, this is like I said, this is a group technique. What we get is what I would call, let's say, an expected value. Okay? Because it has limitations because we can't see on a one-by-one basis. And if there's more than one item that might be subject to social desirability, what we do is iteratively add conditions and leave one item out of this. Okay? So you could just swap them out. These 3, those 3, those 3. Okay? And in each case, you subtract it. Okay? And I didn't make up this technique. There are some really interesting studies that have used this technique. Again, usually with hot button issues like racial prejudice, immigration attitudes. There was this one which just came out about vote buying in Nicaragua. And what they do is the comparison between the traditional agreement statements and the list experiment technique. So they're like the 3 conditions. And in the vote buying experiment, I forget the exact numbers, but it was like on the order of like 10 times more than is estimated by agreement statements. It was like 3% of people will admit that someone paid them for a vote if you ask them an agreement statement, and like 50%, will if you do the list experiment. It's crazy. Okay. So I did this on Mechanical Turk, and this is a study that we're going to present at CHI in May. And this is work I did with Aaron Shaw, who is in the sociology department at Berkeley and also a fellow at the Berkman Center at Harvard. And so we wondered, this is an exploratory study. Would we find anything? Would we find that there were differences between the agreement statements and the list experiment? We didn't know, okay? But one thing we knew is that if you look at the people who are Turkers, there are 2 primary populations. There are lots of people in lots of countries, but it's really a tale of 2 countries, United States and India. It's not only plausible, but probable that those 2 groups of people might have very different motivations for doing the work that they do. Not least of all because the same amount of money can go a lot further to a lot of Indian workers compared to American workers. Okay? So we had some hypotheses about the ways in which our results might be different, but mostly we just realized we needed to have 2 subpopulations. So we did this experiment with about 1,200 US Turkers and 1,200 other Turkers who are from India. And there's a lot of details that had to do with data quality, because when you collect data of this type through Mechanical Turk, it's often very poor. And I'd be happy, that's all in the paper. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that afterwards, especially if you're looking to do something like this. But for now, let's just put that in a black box. Okay. Let me show you what we found for the United States. Okay, so along the vertical axis is the percentage of people who agreed with a particular motivation. And along the horizontal axis are the 4 motivations we asked about. And these we drew from prior studies that were about motivations for crowd work. And we found 4. So killing time or filling up time, having fun, because it gives you a sense of purpose, something to do with your time that matters, and for the money. Okay? And the dark bars represent the results of the straight-up agreement statements, whereas the light bars represent the results of the list experiment. I don't know what jumps out at you guys, but I'll tell you what jumps out at me. Okay, so first of all, people tend to over-report the number of things that motivate them overall in the agreement statement condition. Every one of those dark bars is significantly higher than one of the light bars. And that's pretty interesting to me because it sort of reflects this, what we argue, I guess we don't know because this technique doesn't give us the reason why this happens, but is that there's something about the way that we view work what makes us want to seem highly motivated and intentional. Okay, so the socially desirable thing is to be somebody who knows why they're doing what they do. Right? This is very deeply embedded in the sort of rational actor economic model. And there's lots of social theorists who are way smarter than me who have argued that that's really embedded in our culture and our institutions, and so at least in the sort of Western world. Okay? So that could be one thing that's going on here. Another thing that was really interesting to me is that almost everyone said that the money was important to them when you asked them through agreement statement, but only 70% said that in the list experiment. Now that's still a lot of people, right? But I think it sort of speaks to the idea that money isn't the only thing here. The reason why people do work on Mechanical Turk is about other important things as well. Okay. Now try to get in your mind what the India sample is going to look like. I'll give you a hint. It doesn't really look like this. Boom. Oh, okay, cool. Research high. Great. This is awesome. Okay. What do we see? Okay, first thing, oh my God, not only do people say that money is a reason they do it, it really is a reason they do it, okay? Okay? Again, makes perfect sense because the socioeconomic environment is so different there, okay? But it's actually these other 3 bars which are so interesting to me. Okay, so here's how I would put this. Social desirability seems to encourage Indian Turkers to pretty severely underreport the degree to which killing time and fun are motivations for them, and drastically overreport the degree to which sense of purpose is important for them. Our hypothesis is that this meshes really well with some prior work, which is about things like how the sort of or outsourcing industry grew in India, and how information technology work is sort of has a cultural condition there. It's sort of something very desirable. It's what you aspire to. And if like IT work, even crowd work, even Mechanical Turk work has this place of honor, you might be less likely to say that killing time and fun are reasons why you do it. And you might be much more likely to say that the sense of purpose is really important because IT work is important work, even crowd work. So, do you guys have any thoughts on that? I want to finish pretty soon so we can just have an open discussion. But this is exploratory, right? This is like study 1 of 5. And I just think, so what did we show? Social desirability does seem to affect reports of motivation. Even in a situation like doing crowd work, where it's really not that consequential compared to like admitting you're a racist or admitting you think, gay people shouldn't be president or any of the other ways they've looked at questions with this technique. And not only that, but we're showing something about the contours of the social desirability effects say something about the nature of work and why people do it. So those are the things we're getting out of it. Did I see a question back here? No.
How big were the groups for these AMT experiments?
So the total number in each case was like 1,400, and then we had, especially in India, we had to throw out way more bad data than we did in the United States. That's a known effect. And we oversampled in the control condition for statistical reasons. So it's like a couple hundred, 200, 250, and then oversampled in the control condition. All right, so let me just wrap up really quick and talk about sort of the future. And this is just my thoughts about where we're going with thinking about incentives and motivation and designing better incentive systems, because this is what I do, right? I do all this research. What I'm really interested in is getting better incentive systems. And I would say the main problem we have right now is that incentive systems are one size fits all. And we talked about this earlier, right? And I think there are very good reasons, sort of budgetary reasons and resource-related reasons why people should just, why we throw the same set of features at everybody. But from a research perspective, from a human perspective, we need to do better than that, okay? We need to talk more about incentivizing who and to do what, right? In particular, we've talked about all of this before. People are different, and what we want them to do might be, and what we tell them and how we interface with them and what feedback we give them can depend on what we want them to do. Do we just want them to do more, or do we want them to do better, or do we want them to be satisfied with what they're doing, or all three? Ideally, all three, right? It'd be great if we could just do that. But so we got to do away with this one-size-fits-all model. And there's some good research to draw on. I don't know how many of you have seen this, Richard Bartle. And he did this a long time ago in the context of MUDs. Who's familiar with MUDs? Multi-user dungeons, right? It's like a you've heard of a MUD? Yeah. Yeah. So so this is early text-based adventure games, essentially. And he sort of characterized on the basis of what amounted to some very sort of exploratory qualitative research and observational study was killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. There's been a lot of critique of this model, like we can't straightforwardly apply this to social media, but it speaks to the fact that people have different, we can sort of create personas that are meaningful on Facebook or on Yahoo properties or on Foursquare or on Wikipedia. And why aren't we doing that? So this is the vision that I alluded to earlier, was this idea of adaptive incentive systems. Systems which apply incentives judiciously so as to avoid the problems of cluttered interfaces and sort of gamification fatigue, and which are adaptive to the characteristics of users in a given context. And again, my vision of the three elements of this are understanding how people are different in ways that matter. You're more or less trusting, you're more or less pro-social, you're more or less averse to status signaling. You're more or less attached to a group of people in a way which might be like a multiplier for particular rewards. So individual characteristics, contextual characteristics, which help us understand how patient support communities are different from sports prediction markets, and all the different places where we apply gamification systems. And then third, this idea of trajectories of participation and understanding the different paths that people take so we can treat them appropriately. And along the way, there's lots of things that I think we should pay attention to, including pre-existing motivations, this idea of crowding out that I described earlier, and dispositional characteristics. One that I care a lot about is called social value orientation. And this is people's sort of stable preferences about the distribution of rewards for themselves and for others. So maybe I only care about my own rewards. Maybe I care about yours and mine. Maybe I want to maximize the difference between yours and mine. So that's the kind of thing which can really moderate the influence of an incentive. So these are all things that I'm doing research on. And how do we get there? Okay, so this is sort of hopefully now preaching to the choir, but really just review. I think we need a clearer picture of what motivation really means, that underlying level, that bottom rung, which is the social psychological process. For me, this should be about self-esteem and self-efficacy, group identification, social approval, and all those other things. Okay. And then the second step there, which is something I've been working on at Yahoo with my colleague Ayman Sharma, is are there stable behavioral traces of dispositional taste? Because we can't go out and give everybody a survey and ask them whether they're high trust or low trust or pro-social or self-interested. But maybe somebody's longitudinal behavior on Twitter is indicative of them being a self-interested person, for example. Stay tuned. I may have a paper on that soon. Stop with the kitchen sink. This is not a situation where you can throw everything at the wall to see what sticks. For all the reasons that appeared on that slide and a lot more. And then I think, again, one of the big problems with gamification systems, but incentive systems in general, incentive systems are simple. They boil down to messaging and feedback, okay? And I think that the attitude about that has been very sort of snippet-oriented from here on out, okay? We need to be focusing on the long term, to understand what is it that motivates people to sustain their participation. And across contexts, we know that's two things. A genuine interest in the topic or task or activity, and a social connection to the other people who do it. And of course, each one of those encompasses multiple things, but those are the places we want to live. And I just want to kind of end on a little bit of an optimistic note, right? Which is that online collaboration and social media have already accomplished so much and so much in such a short time, and arguably just sort of by accident. on the basis of participants engaging in things which are interested to them and their already pre-existing motivations and desires, and with very little meaningful help from intelligent or adaptive online incentive systems. And the problem with this is that we haven't given enough attention to whose voices are heard and who we're disenfranchising. Last year I did some research which was about Wikipedia's gender gap. If you're not familiar with this, please read about it, because this is really an important HCI problem, okay? Which is, how does a particular socio-technical system, how is it designed, how is it maintained, how are the people there enact and sort of evolved over time in ways which can be more appealing to, for example, men than women, okay? So Wikipedia has this problem, and it's really hard to know why. What is it about Wikipedia which means that, depending on who you ask, 11 or 17% of contributors are women? That's a tiny fraction, okay? That's not enough if we care about the diversity of voices. And so that's what this is about for me. Not just doing more, because you could argue we have enough Facebook, we have enough Foursquare, we have enough Wikipedia. But not just doing more, but bringing more voices to the table and keeping them there in ways which are engaging and ethical and supportive, and do that in a way which appeals to everybody. So thank you. Guess we have a few minutes for questions. More questions. Or leaving.
What are some ideal systems or systems that are closer to an ideal
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. So often I use the case of BarnStars, but one thing about BarnStars is it's like 1,200 super active Wikipedians who give them to each other. So it's really kind of a small system. Another good example, though, at least in the badging space, would be Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow, I would argue, does a pretty good job at this. One of the things they've done right is that they've iterated many times on the badges with feedback from the community. Okay, so, and the other thing that they're doing well, here's another example. So Google recently introduced these Google News badges. Has anybody seen about this? So you read enough articles or you comment on enough articles in politics or sports, and you get the politics badge. And it has 1, 2, or 3 stars, depending on how active you are. Okay? So in a way, this is pretty sterile, but in another way, it's not. And the way is like this. Number one, it says something about your identity. I think the future of reputation systems and incentive systems is a lot about understanding who you are as a person, your identity, and allowing you to perform it for different groups of people and advertise it in ways which might give you status and reputational rewards. So actually, Google News does a good job of that, because I'm the type of person who reads a lot of sports or celebrity or news, and I want to be seen as somebody like that. The second thing they did that was smart is I don't know if they did this on purpose. They gave the badges agency. So they tell you that it's actually the badges that customize your feed, right? So get a badge, and the badge will get more stories that you are more likely to be interested in. Of course, that's BS, right? It's just an underlying recommendation system, right? And it's looking at your history of what you click on. But they made it seem as though the badge was doing something that was really relevant to you.
So Stanford has been recently offering a lot of online classes with people in like the 65,000 range that are signing up for them. And if you think about now how the motivation of those people changes moving from like a classroom of, as much as 200 and up to like 65,000 who are not talking to each other, do you think that this is going to be, it seems like this is a very appropriate thing to start thinking about in relation to that community that's going to develop?
It is. So there's this collaborative initiative between Mozilla and the MacArthur Foundation, and it's called Open Badges, and Badges for e-learning. And the idea is to use badges as alternative accreditations, to recognize, in particular, Mozilla is interested in its School of Webcraft, which is like an online program for learning JavaScript and CSS3 and HTML and stuff like that. And they basically are trying to say, like, well, you can be recognized for things that are not just traditional topics in the classroom. Not only that, we can do it at scale, and we can do it in a meaningful way with an infrastructure which will allow people to sort of want this as something they might actually put on their CV. I'm pretty skeptical of that as a model, right? And they're just getting started, and they've just held this competition. Basically, people submitted grant ideas for what they would do with this badging infrastructure, and now they've just awarded the grants, and now we're going to have to see what people will do. I'm not sure what I would do. I think I think it's tempting to say, if you have a 65,000 person course, like, of course, you can't, you have to think of something that scales. I would argue that the big challenge there is going to be allowing people to create meaningful social groups and then creating incentive systems that operate in those social groups. So that's part of the problem with web scale, is that very little is meaningful, socially meaningful, to a million other people. Whereas amongst all of us in here, or amongst all my friends, or all my Facebook friends, or all my immediate family, or all the people who love barbecue as much as I do, or whatever, the same reward would have much more meaning, just like the question of being dared to eat a burrito, or 100 burritos. So I think breaking it down is maybe the future there.
I'm thinking in terms of the Stanford online classes and other online courses, they might want to offer, or they might be tempted to offer some kind of accreditation, but on the other hand, they might want to only attract students who are really interested in learning. Mm-hmm. So are there scenarios like that where offering an incentive can be a bad thing and where they might not want to offer an incentive?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's not call it good and bad. Let's just call it different, right? Let's say, if your goal is just to attract as many people as possible, and maybe if the people you want to attract are sort of career go-getters, or like people who are looking for their next job and want to take a step up, then you're fine with the fact that everybody's just looking for an accreditation. But if what you want to do is create a program that sort of incentivizes early passion in the STEM fields, right? So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I always forget the M, right? Then maybe you want to go towards the other end, where you're actually not making it about accreditation, trying to avoid the more instrumental rewards, and focus on some type of feedback that encourages people to feel like they're really making progress, like they're building mastery in a way which is intrinsically satisfying. And you might choose a very different set of user interface techniques for that, different ways to message and feedback. Often it's really just boils down, there's small levers. It really just boils down to really thinking clearly about what you want from people and who these people are.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.